She walked into that ranch expecting to be turned away before she reached the porch. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Send the girl nobody wanted to the man nobody could stand, watch her come crawling back with her tail between her legs, and laugh about it over whiskey at Harlan's saloon. They never expected her to stay. They never expected him to let her. And they absolutely never expected that two broken, discarded people, a woman with nothing and a man with too much anger and too little left to lose, would become the most dangerous thing Coldwater Ridge had ever seen, each other's reason to fight back. This is their story. Stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Chapter 1. What Coldwater Does to the Unwanted. The town of Coldwater Ridge didn't kill people outright. It was too proud for that, too church-going, too convinced of its own civility. Instead, it did something slower, and in its own way more thorough. It simply made you feel like you didn't belong anywhere within its limits, and then it waited for you to leave on your own. Elena Whitmore had been waiting for that feeling to ease for 3 years. It hadn't. She was 26 years old, 5'4" in her worn boots, and possessed of the kind of face that people looked past rather than at. Not ugly, not striking, just unremarkable in the way that made her easy to ignore. Her hair was dark brown and usually pinned back because she couldn't afford to waste time on it. Her hands were already starting to roughen from the laundry work. She had one good dress, one serviceable dress, and 2 aprons she cycled through like they were liturgy. She'd come to Coldwater Ridge from Harlan County with her mother, who died 11 months later of a lung sickness that the town doctor had diagnosed confidently and treated incompetently. Elena had buried her mother in the municipal cemetery, the cheap section where the plots weren't marked with stone, and then she'd had no money to leave and no reason to stay, and so she'd simply stayed the way people do when inertia is cheaper than action. She took in laundry. She helped at the boarding house on Sutter Street run by a woman named Agnes Pruitt, who was somewhere between 50 and 70, and had the warmth of a wrought iron gate in January. Elena cleaned rooms, carried coal, aired linens, and in exchange received a narrow bed in the attic and 2 meals a day, meals being a generous word for what Agnes put on the table. It wasn't a life. It was a holding pattern. And on the morning that everything changed, or started to change, because change in real life doesn't happen all at once, it happens in ugly increments. Elena was standing in Agnes Pruitt's kitchen at 6:45 in the morning, eating cold cornbread over the sink because the kitchen table had 4 chairs and 4 boarders, and none of them had thought to leave room for the girl who'd cooked the cornbread. She wasn't even angry about it. That was the worst part. She'd stopped being angry about things like that somewhere around month 8, and she wasn't sure if that was peace or surrender. The trouble started, as trouble in Coldwater Ridge often did, at Harlan's saloon. Not with a fight, but with a conversation that somebody thought was funny. Elena heard about it secondhand the way she heard about most things. Through the wall between her attic room and the room below it, where one of the boarders, a man named Cecil Dowd, who sold dry goods for a company out of Abilene, talked too loudly about everything. "Sent the Whitmore girl out to Mercer's place," Cecil was telling someone, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who considered himself a raconteur. "Haskell's idea. You know how Jim Haskell gets when he's had 3 whiskeys and a bad hand at cards? Starts thinking he's clever. He told her there was work out there. Domestic work, he said. Housekeeper, cook, whatever Mercer needs." A pause. The creak of a chair. And she believed him? She asked 2 questions, wages and hours, and then she said she'd think on it. Cecil laughed, short and mean. "Think on it, like she's got options. Mercer'll send her back inside a minute. That's the whole point, isn't it? Man hasn't kept help for longer than a week in 3 years. Last woman he hired, she came back into town without her hat and walked straight to the sheriff's office. Wouldn't say what happened, but she was white as a sheet." Another pause, more considered. "Haskell just wants to watch the girl's face when she realizes what she walked into." Upstairs, Elena stood very still beside the wall. She'd heard the name Ronan Mercer before. You didn't live in Coldwater Ridge for 3 years without hearing it. He was one of those figures that a small town constructs out of sparse facts and abundant imagination. The rancher who lived 8 miles outside the town limits on land that had belonged to his family for 2 generations, who came into town twice a month for supplies and spoke to no one if he could help it, who had a temper that men described with a certain careful respect, the way you describe a dog that's bitten before. He'd had a wife once. She was gone now. No one said much about that, but the way they didn't say much about it said plenty. His ranch, by all accounts, was struggling. The house needed work. The land needed work. The man himself, most agreed, needed something, but nobody was sure what. And Jim Haskell, drunk and bored and small in all the ways that mattered, had told Elena Whitmore there was work out there. She'd said she'd think on it. Standing there in the dark of her attic room, listening to Cecil Dowd's laughter fade, Elena thought about what she had to lose. Her list was short. Her room here cost her $8 a month, which Agnes had been taking directly out of her wages since January. 2 weeks ago, Agnes had informed her, pleasantly and without apparent guilt, that the rates were going up to $11. There were also, Agnes explained, some additional charges for lamp oil and hot water that she'd been meaning to discuss. Elena had done the arithmetic 3 times. It came out the same every time. She would owe Agnes money at the end of each month, not the other way around. She would work for free, and then she would owe. She had $43 saved, folded into a handkerchief in the toe of her winter boot. She'd been saving it for 2 years. In a town that paid her what Coldwater paid her, $43 was an enormous, precarious fortune. It was also, she understood clearly, not enough to go anywhere and start over. So she thought about Ronan Mercer's ranch. She thought about it for 4 days, which was longer than most people gave her credit for being capable of thinking about anything. She asked careful, indirect questions, not of people who knew her well, because there weren't many of those, but of people who talked too much to notice what they were being asked. She found out that Mercer's ranch was 8 miles out on the Creed Road, that he ran cattle, or had run cattle, and was now running far fewer than he used to, that his spread was called the Double M, though almost no one called it that anymore. They just called it Mercer's Place, or sometimes the Mercer property, in the tone you use when you're not sure something is going to exist for much longer. She found out that the last 3 people who'd gone out there to work had all come back within a week. One of them, a man named Patterson who did fence mending, said Mercer was impossible to work for, that he changed directions 3 times a day, that he expected too much and explained too little, that he'd stood in a field in a rainstorm and screamed at Patterson for 15 minutes about post depth. Patterson had said this with the pity people reserve for lost causes, shaking his head slowly like a man watching a barn burn. Elena filed that information away. On the 5th day, she told Agnes she needed a morning off and didn't ask permission so much as state it. Agnes made a sound like a stepped-on cat, but Elena was already putting on her coat. Chapter 2. 8 miles out. She walked. She couldn't afford to hire a wagon, and the weather was cold but dry, which counted as cooperating in Coldwater Ridge's terms. The Creed Road was unpaved and unremarkable, cutting through scrub and brown grass and the occasional stand of cottonwood that had somehow survived the last drought. Elena wore her serviceable dress rather than her good one. She wasn't fool enough to go to a working ranch in her best clothes. And she'd eaten before she left, which was a practical decision she'd made deliberately. You don't walk into something that might go badly on an empty stomach. It took her 2 hours and 20 minutes. The Double M came into view slowly, the way things at the end of long roads tend to. First a smudge of structures on the horizon, then details resolving themselves gradually. A barn with a roof that needed attention, a fence line that zigzagged in a way that suggested interrupted repairs, a water trough that had been patched with mismatched wood, a house that was large enough to suggest it had been impressive once, and worn enough to suggest it had been neglected since. She stopped at the gate, a functional gate at least, with a latch that worked, and looked at it for a moment. The place wasn't ruined. That was the first thing she registered, and it mattered. A ruined property is the aftermath of something over. This property looked like something suspended halfway through going wrong, which meant it could still go the other way. The bones were there. The land was there. The barn was structurally sound even if the roof leaked. She could tell by the way it sat, not listing or soft. The house was solid. It just needed someone to stop ignoring it. She lifted the latch and walked in. A dog barked from somewhere around the side of the barn, deep-chested, not hysterical. A working dog's bark, the kind that announces rather than threatens. Elena didn't slow down. She'd grown up around dogs, and she knew the difference between a dog that would bite and a dog that was doing its job. She was 20 feet from the porch when the front door opened. Ronan Mercer was not what she'd expected, though she'd have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. He was big, not in the soft, broad way of men who'd been well-fed, but in the angular, dense way of someone who'd spent years doing physical labor. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and the eyes of a man who had decided some time ago that people were mostly disappointing and had not been given reason to revise that opinion. He was wearing work clothes, canvas trousers, a shirt that had been washed but not ironed, boots that were as functional as hers. He stood on the porch and looked at her the way you look at something unexpected, not with hostility immediately, but with a kind of flattened wariness. "Help you?" he said. Not warmly, not rudely, just factually. "I heard you might need domestic help," Elena said. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever else needs doing inside the house." A long pause. "Who told you that?" She thought about how to answer this question. "Word gets around," she said, which was true, just not completely. He studied her for another moment. She didn't fidget. She'd learned years ago that fidgeting in front of people who were deciding things about you gave them the impression you already knew the answer was no. "It's remote out here," he said, 8 miles from town. "I walked it this morning." Something shifted in his expression, not softened, that wasn't the right word, more like recalibrated. "I had a woman out here last spring," he said, "for cooking. She lasted 4 days. Why'd she leave?" He wasn't expecting the question. She could tell by the slight pause before he answered. Said the work was too hard. "What did the work involve?" Another pause. Longer this time. He was trying to figure out what kind of person asked follow-up questions when being warned off. "Same thing you said. Cooking, cleaning. The house is a state. I've been out here alone and it shows." "Can I see it? The house?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. The dog had gone quiet around the side of the barn. Somewhere behind her, a cold wind moved through the dead grass with a dry, papery sound. "All right," he said finally, and stepped aside. Chapter 3. The State of Things. The house was exactly what he'd said it was. The front room was functional. There was a table, chairs, a cold fireplace with ashes that needed clearing, a bookshelf that held a sparse collection of books, and a considerable collection of dust. The kitchen was the worst of it. The stove needed blacking, the shelves needed reorganizing, there were dishes in the basin that hadn't been dealt with, and the floor had the particular grittiness of somewhere that hadn't been swept in too long to admit. Elena walked through it without comment. She opened the pantry. Sparse, but not empty. She checked the stove for damage beyond neglect. There wasn't any. She looked at the back door, which didn't sit quite right in its frame, and the window above the basin, which had a crack in the lower pane stuffed with a rag. Ronan followed her at a slight distance, arms crossed, watching. "The second bedroom," she said. "What's in there?" "Storage. Nothing valuable. The room I'd use, if I stayed, would need to be the second bedroom." The air in the kitchen changed, not dangerously, just differently. "I haven't offered you the position," he said. "I know, I'm telling you my terms so we don't waste each other's time." She turned and looked at him. "The rate I've been working at in town is $12 a month, meals included. I'd want the same here, plus the use of the room. I can cook, clean, mend, and do whatever else the house needs. I can also turn my hand to things outside if you need it. I grew up on a farm, so I'm not fragile." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a very organized speech." "I thought about it on the walk out. For 8 miles? I had time." Something crossed his face, not quite amusement, but in the same family as amusement. It was gone quickly. "The work here is harder than you think," he said. "I go through people because I expect a full day's work for a full day's wages. I don't tolerate half measures. I don't make allowances for the weather or how tired someone is. If a thing needs doing, it needs doing." "That sounds agreeable to me." He looked at her sharply, like he was checking if she was mocking him. Her face gave him nothing. "There's no one else out here," he said. "It's just me. Some days I don't want conversation. Some days I'm in a foul mood and I'm not pleasant company. That's fine. You don't know what you're agreeing to, Mr. Mercer." She said it evenly, not sharply. "I've been working for Agnes Pruitt at the Sutter Street boarding house for 8 months. I assure you, Whatever your disposition is on your worst day, it is unlikely to surprise me. The corner of his mouth moved, barely. $12 a month, he said. Meals from whatever's in the pantry. I'll buy supplies twice a month. The room is yours to use and keep as you like. I'll clear the storage out by tonight. All right, she said. You want to start today? She looked around the kitchen. I'd like to start with this stove. Chapter 4. What the work. Cost. She blacked the stove that afternoon with a tin of stove black she found under the sink, and it took her 2 hours because it hadn't been done in what looked like a year, and she had to work it into the joints and the lids and the fire door carefully, methodically, the way you approach a thing that's been let go too long. Her fingers were black to the wrists by the end of it, and she'd gone through 2 rags. Ronan was out with the livestock. She heard him occasionally, the distant sound of a gate, a horse moving in the paddock, once his voice saying something short and direct to the dog. He didn't check on her. She didn't need him to. She swept the kitchen floor twice, once to get the surface, once to get the corners. She washed the dishes in the basin, then washed the basin itself. She reorganized the pantry, not drastically but sensibly, putting things where they could be found. She checked the firewood situation and found it adequate for the moment, though she noted it would want replenishing before the real cold settled in. By the time the light started going gold outside the windows, she had a fire going in the stove and a pot of beans on. It was all the pantry offered in abundance, but she'd found onions and salt pork, and she knew what to do with those. The kitchen smelled like something other than neglect for the first time in what she suspected was a long while. Ronan came in through the back door at dusk, stopped, and looked at the room. He didn't say anything for a moment. Beans and cornbread, she said. She was making the cornbread in the cast-iron skillet she'd found hanging on the wall and seasoned with its own history. 20 minutes. He washed his hands at the basin. She noticed he washed them properly, the way working men often didn't bother, and sat down at the kitchen table. You did the floor, he said. Yes. And the pantry. Yes. And the stove. He was looking at the stove. I bought that tin of blacking 8 months ago. I could tell. He was quiet. She put the cornbread in the oven and adjusted the damper. My father built this house, he said. It came out of nowhere, or seemed to. He was the kind of man who kept things up. He would have hated what I've let it become. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. That turned out to be the right choice. The second bedroom, he said after a moment. I moved the storage to the barn this afternoon. There's a bed frame in there and a mattress. Not new, but it's sound. No linens. I brought my own. She had. 2 sheets folded flat in the bag she'd brought from town because she'd suspected Agnes's linens and her own body heat were the only warmth she'd had in the attic room for 8 months, and she wasn't leaving the sheets behind. All right, he said. Dinner was quiet. He ate without apparent complaint, which she was learning to understand was Ronan Mercer's version of praise. He had 2 helpings of the beans, which was definitely his version of praise. I'm going to need to go back to town for the rest of my things, she said, when the dishes were on the drying rack. When? Day after tomorrow, if that suits. I'll need a few hours. He nodded. I can take you in the wagon. I need to get supplies anyway. You don't have to. 8 miles on foot is an unnecessary use of time, he said. And that was the end of it. She went to bed that night in the second bedroom, which was cold but hers, and lay awake for an hour listening to the sounds of a place she didn't know yet, the way the house settled, the way the wind moved differently than it did in town, the far-off sound of cattle. She wasn't afraid. She was, for the first time in a long time, thinking about tomorrow in terms of what needed to be done rather than what she needed to survive. That was a difference she felt in her chest, somewhere behind her breastbone, small and cautious, but real. Chapter 5. Rumors. Travel faster than wagons. She'd been at the Double M for 12 days when the first comment reached her ears. It came again through the mechanism of other people's carelessness. She was in Greer's general store while Ronan loaded feed in the wagon outside, and the woman ahead of her at the counter, a broad, well-dressed woman named Ruth Haskell, Jim Haskell's wife, was in the middle of a conversation with Greer's wife, Mabel, that she didn't bother lowering her voice for. Already moved out to his property, Ruth was saying. Has been for almost 2 weeks, sleeping out there. She's not the first woman to work for him, Mabel said. She's the first one that stayed. Ruth's tone had a particular quality to it, the tone of a woman delivering a verdict dressed up as a concern. And she's young, Mabel, and she's alone with him out there, 8 miles from anyone. Well, is anyone going to do anything about it? Jim says the sheriff could look into it, whether there's anything improper going on. Elena set a spool of thread on the counter and looked at Ruth Haskell pleasantly. Good afternoon, Mrs. Haskell. Ruth turned with the expression of a woman who's been overheard being herself and doesn't have the self-awareness to be embarrassed about it. Miss Whitmore, I couldn't help overhearing. Elena kept her voice level. If you have questions about my employment at the Mercer Ranch, you're welcome to ask me directly. The wages are fair, the work is honest, and the arrangements are proper. Ruth's chin came up. I didn't say they weren't. You were about to. A beat of silence. Mabel suddenly found the counter fascinating. Ruth Haskell gathered herself with the dignity of someone who considers dignity a weapon. I'm simply expressing concern for your welfare, Miss Whitmore. A woman in your position has a position, Elena said. That's more than I had 3 weeks ago. She put her coins on the counter for the thread and picked up her parcel. Have a good afternoon, ladies. She walked out into the pale winter light and climbed up into the wagon without assistance, which she'd gotten good at. Ronan was still loading. He hadn't heard any of it. She didn't tell him, not because she was ashamed, but because she was calculating. She'd learned growing up that information is a resource, and you spend it when it'll do something useful, not just to make yourself feel heard. But she filed Ruth Haskell's face away. The shape of that concern. Chapter 6. What Earned Respect Looks Like. By the end of the first month, Elena had settled into the rhythms of the double M in the way you settle into a difficult piece of music, not by memorizing it all at once, but by learning a few bars at a time until eventually your hands know where to go before your brain catches up. Mornings. She was up before Ronan, which took some doing in the first week because he was an early riser, but she'd always slept light and learned to wake with the first gray of dawn. She had coffee made and something on the stove by the time he came in from the first round of chores, feeding the horses, checking the cattle, whatever the morning required. He took his coffee black and he drank it in two-handed silence at the table, which she respected because she was the same way in the first 15 minutes of being awake. Midday. She managed the house, but she'd started edging outside too. The first time she'd asked if she could help with the fence repair, one of the stretches out near the east pasture that was listing in a way that concerned her. He'd looked at her the way you look at someone who's offered to help you with something personal, and you're not sure you want them to. It's wire fencing, he said. You'll cut your hands. I've repaired wire fencing before. I'll wear the gloves. He didn't argue. He handed her the pliers. She was slower than him. He had 20 pounds of muscle on her and years of the specific practiced motion. But she was steady. She didn't complain about the cold or the wire or the fact that the ground was frozen under the posts, and every adjustment took twice as long as it should have. She just worked. At one point he stopped and watched her for a moment. You hold the pliers wrong. I know. This is how I was taught. Your taught way is inefficient. I'm aware. Here. He came and adjusted her grip, repositioning her hand on the handle. His movements were efficient, impersonal. Like that. You'll get more torque. She tried it. He was right. Thank you. He went back to his section of fence without ceremony. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd received from him. She understood that about him now. That he didn't give praise the way most people did, with words. He gave it with attention. He showed her the better way to hold the pliers. He adjusted the directions he gave her because she'd demonstrated she could follow them. He started leaving things slightly undone in the morning, a stuck hinge, a task that needed 2 people, because he knew she'd handle it. None of this was warmth, exactly, but it was a form of regard, and after 3 years of invisibility, Elena received it like sunlight in a cold room. The evenings were the strangest part. After dinner, which they ate together because the kitchen table was the kitchen table and there wasn't anywhere else, they would sometimes sit for a while. Not by design, it just happened. He'd be mending something or looking at the account ledger he kept in a battered notebook, and she'd be mending something too, or reading if he had a book she hadn't read, which was often enough. The silence between them was functional, neither of them requiring it to be broken just for the sake of sound. But occasionally something would come loose. "Do you miss your family?" he asked one evening, without looking up from the ledger. It was a Tuesday in early December, the wind doing something serious to the eaves. She thought about it honestly. "My mother. I had a brother, but he went west when I was 17, and I haven't heard from him since." A pause. "Do you?" He was quiet for a moment. "My parents are both dead. I have a sister in San Antonio who writes to me twice a year. We were never close." "Why not?" He looked up then, briefly, as if checking whether the question was prying. Her face must have satisfied him that it wasn't. "She married someone who didn't like the ranch, or didn't like me, possibly both. After a while, it stopped mattering which." "That's lonely," Elena said. He looked back at the ledger. "Yes," he said. Just that. No embellishment, no deflection. She went back to her mending. Outside, the wind pushed against the house, and the house pushed back, and neither of them said anything else for the rest of the evening. But when she went to bed that night, she thought about the way he'd said that one word, yes, without flinching from it, without dressing it up in pride or armor. She'd known men who would have sooner cut their own hand off than admitted to being lonely. She thought that was maybe the first real thing he'd said to her. Chapter 7. The Cost of Staying. Christmas passed quietly at the Double M. Ronan bought a small amount of extra sugar on his December supply run, and she made a cake, which he ate 2 pieces of without comment. She'd found a worn card in her bag from her mother, kept from years back, and set it on the windowsill of her room. That was the whole of the holiday. January arrived hard, the kind of January that reminds you that weather has no interest in your situation. The cattle were struggling in the cold. Ronan was out at all hours, and Elena pulled the interior work doubled to keep the house from becoming one more thing he had to manage. She kept the fire going through the night, kept food warm at the back of the stove, had coffee ready at 2 a.m. when he came in half frozen from checking on a calf that hadn't made it. He sat down at the table and she put the coffee in front of him without a word, and he sat with his hands around the mug for a long time before he drank it. "Lost 3 calves this week," he said. "I know. The profit margin on this season is already—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together. "It was a hard winter," she said. "It's always a hard winter. You can't run a ranch on always a hard winter." He wasn't talking to her exactly. He was thinking out loud in the way he'd started doing sometimes, when the space between them had become safe enough for his thoughts to move around in. "My father managed this land for 30 years, and he never lost a herd to weather because he planned for it. He had contingencies. He stopped again, drank his coffee. "He had more help," Elena said carefully, "and more years to build the contingencies." He looked at her. "That's either generous or foolish. Take your pick." Something shifted in his face. Not the ghost of amusement that crossed it sometimes, but something more like recognition. Like he'd looked at her and found something he wasn't expecting to find. He looked away quickly. "The east barn roof is going to go if we don't address it before the next snow," he said. "I know. I've been thinking about it. If we get the lumber from Greer's and I can hold the planking while you nail—" "You're not getting on that roof. I'm lighter than you and I know how it's—" "You're not getting on that roof," he said again. "I'll find another way." She looked at him for a moment. "You could hire Patterson back." "Patterson works for whoever he wants. I can't afford to—" He stopped. His jaw tightened in the way it did when something was costing him pride to say. "My credit at Greer's is already extended." Elena was quiet. This was the thing she'd been watching take shape for weeks. The financial picture of the Double M, visible to her in fragments. The ledger he sometimes left open on the table. The way he calculated twice before any purchase. The quality of the supplies he bought for the cattle versus what he bought for the house. The careful, disciplined frugality of a man who was managing a drop by drop. The ranch was not ruined, but it was close enough to smell it from here. "If I can help bring in more from the livestock side," she said. "If I take on more of the outdoor work—" "You're already working 12 hours a day." "Then 13, Mr. Mercer." She waited until he looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere. I don't say that as a sentiment. I say it as a practical statement. I have nowhere to go, and this place is worth saving, and I would like to help save it." He looked at her for a long time. "Why?" he said. And it came out without defenses. Honest in a way that surprised even him, she thought. She thought about it. Because it's the first place I've been where the work I do actually matters to the outcome, she said. At Agnes Pruitt's, I could have swept that floor or not swept it, and no one's life would have been different. Here, she gestured vaguely at the house, the window, the darkness beyond where the cattle stood in the cold. Here it matters. He was quiet for a very long time. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind had dropped to something bearable. We'll figure out the roof, he said finally. It wasn't an answer to what she'd said, but she understood it as one. Chapter 8. What the town decided she'd been at the Double M for 7 weeks when Agnes Pruitt gave her room away. This shouldn't have mattered. She was living at the ranch now. She'd moved most of her things, but Agnes had kept the room nominally in her name, and Elena had paid through the end of January as a kind of insurance. The fact that Agnes rented it to someone else 3 weeks early and pocketed the overpayment was both illegal in a minor, unenforceable way and deeply, characteristically, Agnes. What it meant practically, Elena had no fallback. What it meant in the town's understanding, she was living out at Mercer's place, permanently, with a man who wasn't her kin. That distinction, which would have been unremarkable in a city or on a frontier where people understood that labor was labor and survival was survival, meant something very specific in Coldwater Ridge. Coldwater Ridge was a town that believed itself to be civilized, and civilized, as it understood the word, required a particular set of arrangements between men and women, arrangements that had names, arrangements that were witnessed. Elena at Mercer's place was not an arrangement with a name. It was a situation. And situations of that particular type, in Coldwater Ridge's moral taxonomy, were the kind that decent people were obligated to discuss. Ruth Haskell discussed it with the ladies' auxiliary. The ladies' auxiliary discussed it with their husbands. Jim Haskell, who had started the whole thing as a joke at a card table, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to take a position on something he'd intended as entertainment. He chose the righteous position, as men like Jim Haskell always do when entertainment goes sideways. He began talking about community standards. Sheriff Cole Patterson, no relation to the fence mender, though they shared the family stubbornness, started receiving what he later described as inquiries about the situation at the Mercer property. Elena didn't know any of this with any precision. She knew it the way you know a weather change before it arrives. In her body first, an attention that gathered whenever she came into town, in the way eyes moved and then moved away, in the quality of the silence that fell around her at Greer's counter. She mentioned it to Ronan one evening in February. People in town are talking about me being out here, she said. He looked up from the ledger. People in town talk about everything. This is different from ordinary gossip. She kept her voice even. This is the organized kind. He set the ledger down. What are they saying? I haven't heard exactly. A pause. I don't need to hear exactly. I know the shape of it. His expression did something complicated. A tightening around the eyes, a set of the jaw. They can say what they want. You're employed here. That's all there is to it. Is it? What do you mean, is it? Not sharply, genuinely asking. She looked at him. She'd been at the Double M for 7 weeks, and she knew his face now with the particular knowledge that comes from proximity. She knew the difference between his different silences, the tells of his moods, the way his shoulders sat when something was weighing on him and when it wasn't. She looked at him, and she chose her words carefully. I mean that what this is matters to what they'll do about it, she said. If it's employment, there are limits to what they can reasonably do. If they decide it's something else, it's employment. I know that. You know that. She held his gaze. They're going to decide what they decide regardless. He was quiet. He picked up the ledger again, but he wasn't looking at it. His hand rested flat on the open page. Let them talk, he said finally. She went to bed thinking he wasn't wrong exactly, but he wasn't right either, because she'd grown up invisible in a small town, and she knew something he maybe didn't. When a small town decides to see you, it's never neutral. Being seen by Coldwater Ridge wasn't like being seen by a person. It was like being seen by a crowd. And crowds, once they've decided something, don't decide it quietly. The knock on the front door came 3 weeks later. It was the sheriff. She was in the kitchen when she heard it, and she stood still for a moment, her hands in the dishwater, and felt the thing she'd been waiting for arrive. What? Ronan's boots on the floorboards, the sound of the front door opening, a voice she didn't recognize. Official, measured, the voice of someone delivering something they've been instructed to deliver. She dried her hands, she smoothed her apron. She walked to the doorway of the front room and stood there, and she listened to what the sheriff had come to say, and she looked at Ronan's back and the set of his shoulders, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, not yet. This is not where I fall. She'd come 8 miles on foot for this job. She'd blacked that stove with her bare hands. She'd repaired the fence in frozen ground and cooked in a kitchen that had been a wreck and slept in a room that was cold, but hers. She hadn't walked into this wilderness to be walked back out of it by the organized disapproval of people who hadn't given her a second look when she was drowning in plain sight. Not yet. Not quietly. Not without a fight. Sheriff Cole Patterson was not a cruel man. That was the first thing Elena registered when she stepped into the doorway of the front room and got a clear look at him. He was mid-50s, thick through the middle, with a gray mustache and the expression of someone who had been handed a task he didn't entirely believe in but was going to carry out anyway, because that was the nature of his office, and he took his office seriously. He had his hat in his hands. That told her something. "Miss Whitmore?" he said, acknowledging her with a small nod when he saw her in the doorway. "Sheriff." Ronan hadn't moved. He was standing with his arms at his sides, not crossed. She'd noticed he never crossed his arms, as if he'd decided somewhere along the way that defensive postures were a form of admission. He was just standing, looking at Patterson with that particular flat patience of his. "I'll be direct," Patterson said. He was talking to both of them now, which Elena appreciated more than he probably knew. "I've received complaints from several members of the community regarding the arrangement out here, the nature of Miss Whitmore's residency." "Her residency is as my employee," Ronan said. "She works here. She lives here because the work is here and the town is 8 miles away." "I understand that, Mr. Mercer, and I'm not here to tell you you've done anything unlawful." Patterson turned his hat brim once in his hands, a nervous gesture he probably didn't know he was making. "I'm here because the people making these complaints are the kind of people who don't stop at complaints. I've been asked to look into it. I've looked into it. I don't see anything that concerns me personally." A pause. "But I want you both to understand what you're dealing with. Jim Haskell has been to see Councilman Briggs twice this week." Ronan's jaw tightened. "Haskell," he said, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone putting a name in a category. "He's framing it as a welfare concern," Patterson said. He glanced at Elena. "For you, Miss Whitmore, that you're in a vulnerable position, that someone should verify you're here of your own accord." Elena looked at him steadily. "I'm here of my own accord. I know that. I walked 8 miles on a cold morning to ask for this job," she said. "I was not sent for. I was not recruited. I came because I needed work and the work was here. I know that too." Patterson put his hat back on, which meant he was done with the official portion of things and moving to the personal. "Miss Whitmore, I'm going to be plain with you. I'm going to be plain. Haskell and his crowd aren't going to let this sit. And Briggs has the ear of the county circuit judge. I can only do so much." "What are they planning to do?" Ronan asked. "I don't know the particulars, but I'd expect more visits, more official ones." He looked between them. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you to be ready for it." After he left, the silence in the front room lasted a long time. Ronan stood by the window, watching the sheriff's horse disappear down the Creed Road. His back was to her. She couldn't read his shoulders the way she usually could. They were too still, which was itself a kind of signal. "This is my fault," he said finally. "How is it your fault? I hired you without thinking about what the town would make of it." Elena felt something heat up in her chest, not quite anger, but close to its address. "You hired me because the work needed doing and I was willing to do it. That's the entire story. What Jim Haskell makes of it is Jim Haskell's problem." Ronan turned from his window. "Jim Haskell's problems have a way of becoming other people's problems. That's how men like him operate." "I know how men like him operate," she said. "I've been on the receiving end of men like him my whole life. They talk loudest when they think you're scared." He looked at her. "Are you?" The question was quiet, genuine. not a test. She thought about lying and decided against it. A little, she said. Scared isn't the same as stopped. Something moved across his face, something she didn't have a name for yet. He looked away before she could study it. You don't have to stay, he said. If this gets worse, if it starts costing you, you can go. I'll write you a letter, a good one. You'd find work somewhere else. I'm not going, she said. Elena, it was the first time he'd used her first name. She thought he might not have noticed he'd done it. I said I'm not going. She said it quietly, not as a challenge, but as a fact. You can stop offering me exits. I'm not looking for one. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and went to put his boots back on, because there were still 3 hours of daylight left and the cattle didn't care about Jim Haskell. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the basin for a minute with her hands flat on the counter, taking stock of herself. Her heart was going a little fast. That was fine. Fast hearts were manageable. It was the hearts that stopped that caused problems. She put water on for coffee and started thinking about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was Mabel Greer. Mabel arrived at the Double M unannounced on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the sheriff's visit, driving her own small wagon with a covered dish in the back that she presented to Elena at the door with the particular expression of a woman who has decided that social obligation requires a friendly face even when the social obligation itself is hostile. I brought a pie, Mabel said. Apple. Elena took the pie. Thank you, Mrs. Greer. Would you like to come in? This was, she suspected, exactly what Mabel had come for. She brought her in and put coffee on and set the pie on the table, and they sat across from each other in the kitchen, and Mabel looked at the kitchen with the eyes of a woman cataloging rather than visiting. The stove, cleaned. The floor, clean. The shelves, organized. The window with the cracked pane, repaired now with actual glass that Ronan had brought back from town in January. You've done a lot with it, Mabel said. The house needed attention. Edward Greer says Mr. Mercer's been buying more supplies lately, better quality. When a household is being managed properly, it makes sense to stock it properly. Mabel wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She was not a bad woman, Elena had decided. She was a woman who lived in a particular world with particular rules, and the rules were the walls of the only house she'd ever known. You couldn't hate her for the architecture. Miss Whitmore, Mabel said carefully, there are people in town who are worried. I want you to know that some of us, the concern is genuinely for you. Which people are worried about me, Elena said, and which people are worried about what I represent? Mabel blinked. I'm not sure I understand the distinction. Worry about me would look like asking whether I'm safe, whether I'm paid fairly, whether I have what I need. Worry about what I represent looks like discussing my sleeping arrangements with the county councilman. Elena looked at her calmly. Which kind has Jim Haskell been doing? Mabel's mouth opened, then closed. Then, he means well. Jim Haskell sent me out here as a joke, Elena said. He told me there was domestic work available because he thought Ronan Mercer would frighten me back into town inside an hour, and then he could laugh about it. That's what started this. Not concern, not worry. A joke that didn't land the way he expected. She took a sip of her coffee. I don't have any interest in pretending otherwise. Mabel was quiet for a long moment. You're very direct. I've had to be lately. People will talk regardless, you know. Whether or not I know. It would be easier if there were a different arrangement, something more formal. Elena set her cup down. Mrs. Greer, I'm going to say this once, plainly. There is nothing improper happening at this ranch. The work is real, my employment is legitimate, and I have been treated with more basic respect here than I was treated with at Agnes Pruitt's boarding house for 8 months, and nobody sent the sheriff to Agnes Pruitt's door. Her voice was level. The town's problem is not with what's happening here. The town's problem is with what it imagines might be happening here. And those are two different things, and I am not going to rearrange my life to manage the town's imagination. Mabel left an hour later, the covered dish back in her wagon. Elena had thanked her for the pie and sent the dish back because she didn't want to owe Mabel Greer the return of a dish. Small obligations were how other people's hands got into your life. She told Ronan about it that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. Mabel Greer's a gossip, he said when she'd finished. But she's not vicious. She'll report back to Ruth Haskell that you're settled and sensible and the house is in order. That might buy us something. Or it'll make them more interested, Elena said. A woman who's scared and miserable is a different kind of problem than a woman who's comfortable and clear-eyed. He thought about that. You think they'll push harder because you're not crumbling? I think some of them will, yes. He was quiet for a long moment. The lamp threw a warm circle on the table between them. Outside, February was doing something miserable with sleet against the windows. There's something I should tell you, he said. She looked up. My wife. He said it like he was lifting something heavy. Clara. She left 3 years ago. She didn't die, she left. She went to her sister's in Denver and she wrote me one letter, and in the letter she said the ranch was killing her and she couldn't do it anymore. A pause. She wasn't wrong, probably. I wasn't easy to live with. I was angry about the ranch failing and I took it out on the silence mostly, but the silence and the isolation were things she needed relief from, and I didn't know how to give her that. Elena waited. The town assumed the worst, he said. When she left, they didn't know she'd gone to Denver. They saw her leave and they assumed. He looked at the lamp. I let them assume. I was angry and I was ashamed, and I didn't see why I owed them an explanation. That's why they talk about you the way they do. Partly, his mouth twisted. Partly, I just have a temper and I've told several people to go to hell very directly, and small towns remember that kind of thing. Elena looked at him. Are you divorced? Legally separated. The paperwork went through last spring. He said it without drama, the way you state a fact that hurt once and doesn't hurt the same way anymore. She's remarried now, I think. Someone in Denver with a proper house and a proper income. I'm sorry, Elena said. Don't be. She made the right call. He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, set it down. I'm telling you because you need to know what they're working with. When they go digging, and Haskell will go digging, they'll find a man with a failed marriage and a failing ranch and a temper, and they'll use it. They can use whatever they find, Elena said. It doesn't change anything I know from being here. He looked at her, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something that wasn't information or logistics or ranch business, something that belonged to a different category of conversation entirely. His face moved through something she couldn't quite follow. Then he said, I'm going to fix the east fence post tomorrow before the ground thaws too soft. You don't have to help with that one. I'll hold the posts, she said. Elena, I'll hold the posts. He made a sound that might, in better lighting, have been something approaching amusement, and got up to bank the fire for the night. She sat at the table for another minute after he went down the hall, her hands around her empty cup. The sleet was hitting the windows in irregular bursts, and the lamp was burning low, and the house was solid around her in the way it had gotten to feel solid. Not comfortable exactly. Nothing here was exactly comfortable, but present. Real. Hers in the way that things you work for become yours in a way that things given to you never quite do. She'd come here to not be invisible anymore. She hadn't known that was what she was coming for. But sitting in this kitchen at the end of a hard February day, with the knowledge that harder things were coming and the equally clear knowledge that she was not going to run from them, she understood it. The town had sent her out here to fail. She'd found something to build instead. And the building wasn't finished. March came in the way it always did in that part of the country. Not with relief, but with ambivalence, cold mornings and deceptive afternoons that made you think winter was finished before it knocked you sideways again with a late freeze. Elena had learned the rhythms of the double M through every variation of weather by now, and she no longer needed to be told what a dropping barometer meant for the cattle or what a particular quality of morning light meant for the day's work ahead. She just knew. The knowing had come slowly, accumulated the way calluses do, through repetition and discomfort, until one day you realized the thing that used to hurt doesn't anymore. What she hadn't learned to read was the town. The first real sign that something had shifted came on the first Tuesday of March, when Ronan returned from his supply run 4 hours later than expected. She heard the wagon before she saw it, coming down the road in the late afternoon gray, and something in the pace of the horse told her before he climbed down from the seat that the trip had gone wrong somewhere. He came inside without his coat, which meant he'd left it in the wagon, which meant he'd been too occupied with something to think about his coat. She put coffee in front of him and waited. Greer's extended credit is cut, he said. She sat down across from him. Since when? Since this morning, apparently. Edward Greer told me there'd been a conversation with the bank, that the bank had concerns about the stability of the double M as a credit risk. He wrapped both hands around the mug. His knuckles were pale. Greer looked embarrassed. I'll give him that much. He didn't enjoy telling me. Was it the bank's idea? Ronan's jaw moved. Greer didn't say whose idea it was, but the bank's primary shareholder in this county is Franklin Briggs. Councilman Briggs. The name landed between them with the weight it deserved. They're going after the ranch's finances, Elena said. They're squeezing. He said it flatly, without the anger she might have expected, which told her he'd already been angry about it for 4 hours and had arrived somewhere past anger. If I can't get supplies on credit, and I can't sell cattle until late spring, I have maybe 6 weeks before I'm making decisions I don't want to make. What kind of decisions? He looked at her directly. The kind where I sell off land to cover debt, or stock, or both. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked as the fire settled. This is because of me, Elena said. Not self-pity, just accounting. This is because of Haskell and Briggs and whatever they've decided my situation represents. His voice had an edge now, the kind that came from precision rather than volume. You didn't do this. I know. But I'm the lever they're using. She looked at the table, thinking. If you left, they'd have won and the credit still wouldn't come back, he said. Men like Briggs don't stop when you give them what they want. They stop when there's nothing left to take. Giving ground to them is just teaching them where to push next. She looked up at him. He was right. She knew he was right because she'd watched this exact mechanism operate on smaller scales her entire life. The Agnes Pruitts of the world didn't stop raising the rent when you paid the higher rate. They raised it again. Then we figure out the 6 weeks, she said. He almost said something. She could see him stop himself, and she understood that whatever he'd almost said was in a register he wasn't comfortable with yet. So she let it go and pulled the ledger toward her from the edge of the table where he'd set it coming in. Show me the numbers, she said. All of them. Not the version you think I can handle. The actual numbers. He hesitated for a moment, then turned the ledger to face her. They sat with it for 2 hours. It was not pretty. The debt to Greer's was manageable in isolation. The combination of that debt with the cattle losses from January and the cost of the lumber they'd bought for the east barn roof, which had needed more repair than anticipated and always does, created a picture that required careful navigation. Elena was not an accountant, but she'd been managing scarcity her entire adult life. And managing scarcity teaches you arithmetic in a way that prosperity never quite does. If you sell the 4 yearlings now instead of waiting for the spring market, she started, I lose 30% on the price. You lose 30% or you lose the option entirely if Briggs makes another move before April. He was quiet. He hated this. She could see that. Not the math, but the position. The reduced position. The one where you're choosing between bad and worse rather than between adequate and good. His father had built this ranch on choices that had better options than these, and the distance between then and now sat on Ronan Mercer like a physical weight. Sell the yearlings, she said. Take the 30%. It buys time, and time is what we need. He nodded slowly. I'll ride out to Decker's tomorrow. He'll take them. She wrote the revised number in the margin of the ledger. Her handwriting looked strange next to his, smaller and more upright. She realized she'd never written in his ledger before and wondered for a second if he'd mind, and then looked at his face and understood that he didn't. What came 3 days after that, though, was the thing she hadn't prepared for. 2 men came out on a Wednesday morning when Ronan was in the far pasture and Elena was beating a rug over the porch rail, one of those domestic tasks that looks minor and requires more physical effort than anyone who hasn't done it understands. She heard horses and looked up and saw them coming down the Creed Road. Not the sheriff, not a wagon, 2 men on horseback with the particular upright posture of people who have been sent somewhere officially. They introduced themselves at the gate. A man named Aldous Crane, who was some kind of county official attached to Briggs's office, and a younger man who wrote things in a notebook and didn't give his name. Crane was in his 40s, thin, wearing a jacket that was too good for the road he'd just ridden. He had the manner of a man who'd learned to deliver unpleasant things with the surface texture of civility. "We're conducting a welfare review," Crane told her, standing at the base of the porch steps and looking up at her with an expression calibrated to suggest he was doing her a favor. "On behalf of the county, standard procedure when concerns are raised about a citizen's well-being." "Whose well-being?" Elena said, still holding the rug beater. "Yours, Miss Whitmore." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm beating a rug." "Yes." "On my own porch." Crane's mouth thinned slightly. "On Mr. Mercer's porch." "On the porch of the property where I'm employed," she said, "which I was just now in the process of maintaining. That's what the rug beater is for." The notebook man wrote something. She wondered what he'd found to write. "Perhaps we could come inside," Crane said. "Ask you a few questions." "Mr. Mercer's in the pasture. I'd rather wait until he's back before I invite county officials into his house." "This review concerns you, not Mr. Mercer." "Then you can ask me your questions here." She set the rug beater against the rail and folded her arms. The morning was cold and she was in her work dress and apron, and she was aware that she did not look like someone who required rescuing, but she also understood that Crane's assessment of what she looked like was probably already decided. "Go ahead." What followed was 20 minutes of questions that were individually reasonable and collectively invasive. How long had she been employed here? What were her duties? What were her living arrangements? Was she compensated fairly? Did she have freedom of movement? And here Crane's voice took on a particular careful weight. Was there anything about her situation she found concerning? Anything she would want an outside party to know? Elena answered every question directly, without elaboration that he hadn't asked for, and without the nervous excess of detail that people produce when they're hiding something. She had nothing to hide. That was the entire point. She answered like someone who had nothing to hide, and had also noticed that the questions were designed to suggest that she might. "My situation is that I'm employed," she said when he'd reached the end of his list. "I'm paid fairly. I live in my own room. I go into town when I need to, and no one has told me I can't do anything. If there is a specific concern that these questions are meant to address, I'd appreciate you stating it plainly." "The county has received reports." "From whom?" Crane paused. "I'm not at liberty to—" "Jim Haskell," Elena said. "And Franklin Briggs. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm telling you I already know." She stepped down one porch step so that she was closer to his eye level, and he had to adjust slightly to maintain the posture of authority. "I understand that you've been sent here because certain people in this county have decided that my living arrangement is their business. I am telling you, as clearly as I know how to say it, that it is not. I'm a free adult woman who works for a fair wage in a legitimate household. If the county has concerns about my welfare, I am here, I am well, and I am choosing to be here. That is the extent of what the county is owed." Malchetam. Crane looked at her for a long moment. The notebook man had stopped writing. "I'll need to speak with Mr. Mercer as well," Crane said. "He'll be in from the pasture within the hour. You're welcome to wait in the yard." She didn't invite them in. They waited in the yard and she went back inside and put water on because her hands were shaking very slightly and she needed something to do with them, and she didn't want them to see that. Ronan came in from the pasture 40 minutes later and found 2 county officials standing by their horses in his yard. Elena watched from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear what was said, but she could read Ronan's body language with the accuracy that 7 weeks of proximity had given her. The controlled stillness at the beginning, the moment somewhere in the middle where his shoulders went tight and he made a visible effort to keep his voice level. The deliberate physical step back he took when whatever Crane said required a physical step back to avoid saying something that would be used against him. He was better at it than she'd expected. She'd braced for his temper. He kept it locked, which she understood must have cost him something. They left after another 20 minutes. Ronan came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "They're recommending a formal review," he said, "in front of the county council. 3 weeks from now." Elena set her cup down. "What does that mean, formally?" "It means Briggs gets to stand in a room and say whatever he wants about this ranch, and about you, and about me, and I have to answer for it in front of people who already believe him." His voice was flat with the specific flatness of controlled fury. "It means they've found a mechanism." She thought about this carefully. "Can you get a lawyer?" "I know a man in Dalton who does property law. He's not cheap." Send him a letter today. Ronan looked at her. Elena, today, she said, before Briggs gets 3 more weeks to prepare and we get 3 more weeks of doing nothing. She looked at him steadily. You said yourself that giving ground just teaches them where to push. A lawyer is not giving ground. A lawyer is showing up. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the desk in the front room and found paper. The letter went out the next morning with the supply wagon heading toward Dalton. Elena watched it go from the porch and felt the particular mix of relief and dread that comes from committing to a fight you're not sure you can win. The following 2 weeks were the strangest she'd spent at the Double M. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing dramatic happened, and the waiting had its own particular texture. She worked, she cooked, cleaned, mended. She helped with the cattle more than she had before because Ronan had sold the 4 yearlings to Decker, and the remaining animals needed more careful management. Her hands had stopped being soft entirely. They were working hands now, the kind that catch on fabric when you smooth a sheet, the kind that feel the cold differently than they used to. Ronan was quieter in those 2 weeks. Not in the early way, the closed-off silence of someone who'd decided other people were a waste of attention. This was a different quiet, the kind that comes from thinking hard about something you haven't figured out yet. She left him to it mostly. But one evening, 5 days before the council hearing, he came into the kitchen while she was making dinner and stood by the window for a long moment before he spoke. I want to tell you something, he said. She kept her attention on the stove. All right. I know this started not the way things start when they're planned outright. I know the whole business with Haskell sending you out here was meant to be a humiliation. He said humiliation like it was a word he'd thought carefully about using. And I know I didn't make it easy. I gave you impossible work, and I was short-tempered, and He stopped. I was not easy. No, she agreed. But you stayed. I stayed. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know what this is going to look like after the council hearing. Briggs has a lot of leverage, and I don't know what the lawyer can actually do. I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever they decide, I'm not going to let it land on you. If it comes down to me having to do something to protect your name, your ability to find work somewhere if this goes wrong, I'll do that. She turned from the stove and looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the window, at his own reflection in the dark glass. Ronan, she said. The first name came out naturally. She'd stopped noticing when she'd started using it. What exactly are you offering? He turned then. His expression was the most unguarded she'd ever seen it. Not comfortable, not resolved, just open in the way that faces go when someone has decided to say a thing and is committed to seeing it through regardless of where it lands. I'm not sure yet, he said honestly, but I'm thinking on it. She held his gaze. Think faster, she said. We've got 5 days. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the March wind pushed at the windows, the same as it had every night since she'd arrived, and the house held against it, the same as it always did, imperfect and worn and stubbornly, uncomplicatedly standing. The lawyer's name was Gerald Foss, and he arrived from Dalton 2 days before the council hearing in a coat that had seen better decades and with a leather case so worn the stitching had separated along one side and been re-sewn with a slightly different thread. He was somewhere in his 60s, compact, with the unhurried manner of a man who had sat in enough difficult rooms to stop being impressed by them. Elena liked him immediately, which she recognized was not a reliable metric but was at least a starting point. He sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the employment agreement she and Ronan had written up in January. Ronan's idea, quietly, after the sheriff's first visit, 2 sentences on paper that established her wages and her duties in both their signatures. And he read everything twice before he said anything. The employment agreement helps, he said. It's not a fortress, but it's a wall. Shows there was structure to this from the beginning. Will it be enough? Ronan asked. Foss set the paper down. Depends on what Briggs is actually trying to accomplish. If he wants to embarrass you publicly, the hearing gives him that regardless of what I do. If he wants legal remedy, removal of Miss Whitmore from the property, some kind of injunction, he's on much weaker ground than he probably thinks. He looked between them. The problem is that Briggs knows this county, and I don't. He may have already done things I can't see yet. What kind of things? Elena asked. Talked to the right judge. Called in the right favor. Small county politics has its own architecture. Foss picked up his coffee mug. Tell me about the people on the council. All 5 of them, not the official version, the real version. They talked for 2 hours. Elena knew more than she'd realized she knew. She'd been collecting information about Coldwater Ridge's social machinery for 3 years without quite meaning to, the way you absorb the layout of a house you live adjacent to. She knew which councilman owed his seat to Briggs's endorsement and which one had a complicated history with Jim Haskell's family. She knew that the 5th councilman, a rancher named Theodore Marsh from the north end of the county, had lost a grazing dispute to a well-connected landowner 3 years ago and had not forgotten it. Foss listened to all of it with his eyes on the table, occasionally writing a word or two. You, he said to Elena when she'd finished, you're going to need to speak at this hearing. I plan to. Not just answer questions. Speak. As in, say what you want to say before they shape the narrative around you. He looked at her steadily. These hearings have a momentum to them. Briggs will establish a picture in the first 10 minutes, and everyone in the room will start seeing through that picture, whether they mean to or not. You have to put a different picture up before his has time to set. What picture? The true one, Foss said simply, which is more interesting than his version anyway, if you tell it right. She spent that evening thinking about what she would say, not writing it out. She'd found over the years that written speeches came out of her mouth sounding written, and written things sounded like they'd been prepared to deceive even when they hadn't. She thought about it instead, turned it in her mind the way you work a problem until the shape of it becomes clear. Ronan found her on the porch after dinner, standing in the cold without a coat, which she hadn't noticed until he came out and handed her one. You're going to freeze, he said. I was thinking. You can think inside. I think better in the cold. She put the coat on, though. It was his, large on her shoulders, smelling of horses and wood smoke. She didn't comment on it, and neither did he. They stood in silence for a moment. The night was clear, cold. The stars overhead, the particular density you only got far from town lights. I've been thinking about what I said, he said, before, about having something to offer you if things went wrong. She waited. It wasn't, I want to be clear, it wasn't from pity. He said it carefully, like a man who has rehearsed the words, but is now discovering they don't sit the same spoken aloud. I don't pity you. I don't think I've ever thought about you in those terms. I know, she said. How do you think about me? A pause. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Like someone I rely on, he said, which is not something I've said about another person in a long time. Another pause. Like someone I'd rather not do any of this without. Elena looked at the dark line of the pasture fence. The cattle were shapes in the dark beyond it. What exactly are you asking me, Ronan? I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me. He said it without decoration, the way he said most things, the same tone he used for fence posts and cattle counts and weather. But underneath the tone was something careful and exposed, and she'd known him long enough now to hear the difference. Not for the town, not for the hearing. I know the timing makes it look like I know how it looks. But I've been thinking about it since January, and I didn't say anything because I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was solving a problem. Aren't you? I'm trying to tell you I want to, he said. Whether there's a hearing or not, whether Briggs ever existed or not. He turned to look at her then, and his face in the dark was serious in the way his face was when he meant something beyond argument. I'm asking because you're the first person in 3 years who's made this place feel like it's worth the fight. And because I'd rather stand next to you at that council hearing as your husband than as your employer, and not entirely for practical reasons. Elena was quiet. She thought about Agnes Pruitt's attic room. She thought about 8 miles of frozen road on an empty stomach. She thought about the stove she'd blacked alone the first afternoon, about the way he'd corrected her grip on the pliers without making her feel small for holding them wrong. She thought about the fact that she was wearing his coat and had not thought to question it. I need to sleep on it, she said. All right. That's not a no. I know, he said, and she believed that he did. She lay awake for a long time that night in her room, hers absolutely in every way that mattered, and she thought about the distinction she'd made to herself months ago between peace and surrender. This was not surrender. Surrender would have looked like leaving when the sheriff first knocked, like shrinking when Ruth Haskell looked at her with that particular cataloging contempt, like apologizing to Mabel Greer for taking up space in a life she'd built herself. This was something else. This was looking at a man who'd asked her a real question and deciding whether the answer was real too. By 4 a.m, she knew what it was. She told him at breakfast, before Foss was up and before the day had properly started, when it was just the two of them and the early light coming gray through the kitchen windows. "Yes," she said, setting his coffee in front of him. He looked up. "My answer is yes," she said, "but I want to be clear about my terms. Tell me." "This is a partnership. Not you managing me. Not me deferring to you on things I know better than you do. We make decisions together, including decisions about this ranch." She held his gaze. "If I'm going to stake my name on this, I'm staking it on an equal arrangement or not at all." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how good I'll be at that." "I know. I'm telling you the expectation anyway." She sat down across from him. "And I want a real marriage, not a convenience, not a legal solution that we both pretend isn't lonely." Something moved in his expression, something honest and a little raw. "I don't want that either," he said. "Then we understand each other." "I think we've understood each other for a while," he said. "I was just slow to name it." She picked up her coffee. "You're slow at most things." "That's not true. You took 4 months to adjust my grip on those pliers." The corner of his mouth moved. "I adjusted it within the first week." 6 weeks. 3. "We can argue about it later," she said. "Drink your coffee." Foss drove them into Coldwater Ridge the morning of the hearing in Ronan's wagon. The town was not large enough for the county council to have its own dedicated building. The hearing was held in the meeting room attached to the church hall, a rectangular space with wooden folding chairs and windows that let in insufficient light. By the time they arrived, the chairs were already filling. Elena had not expected quite so many people. She should have. Small towns treat public hearings the way cities treat theater. She walked in behind Foss with Ronan beside her and felt the room adjust to their entrance. Not dramatically, not with the movie silence of everyone turning at once, but in the way a room registers something it's been waiting for. Heads turned, conversations lowered. Ruth Haskell, seated 4 rows back, looked at Elena with an expression that mixed satisfaction and something more complicated underneath it, something Elena chose not to examine too closely. Franklin Briggs was already at the front of the room at the council table with 3 other councilmen. The 5th, Theodore Marsh, the rancher from the North End, was slightly separate from the others, which Elena noted. Briggs was a large man going soft, with silver hair, and the practiced authority of someone who had been the most important person in most rooms for long enough that he'd stopped needing to work at it. He looked at Elena and Ronan with the measured pleasantness of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. Jim Haskell was in the 2nd row. He didn't look at her. Aldous Crane, the county official who'd come to the ranch, sat to Briggs's right with his notebook. The hearing opened with Briggs speaking for 11 minutes. He was good at it. Elena gave him that. He didn't accuse directly. He expressed concern. He invoked community standards with the easy fluency of a man who had been invoking community standards since before Elena was born. He described the situation at the Double M as troubling, as requiring oversight, as the kind of arrangement that left a vulnerable young woman without proper protection or legal standing. He said Miss Whitmore's presence at the ranch, unchaperoned and in a domestic capacity, raised questions that the community had an obligation to address. He proposed, at the end, that Elena Whitmore be formally removed from the property until such time as the county could verify the propriety of the arrangement to its satisfaction. Foss rose and spent 8 minutes disassembling Briggs's argument with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd been doing this for 40 years. He produced the employment agreement. He produced records showing Elena's wages paid. He pointed out, with careful courtesy, that the county had no legal mechanism for removing a person from a place of employment without evidence of specific harm, of which none had been produced because none existed. Briggs's face remained pleasant throughout. He was not a man who showed his cards. Then the council chair invited Elena to speak. She stood up. The room settled in a way it hadn't for Foss or for Briggs. A different kind of settling, the kind that happens when people are genuinely uncertain what they're about to hear. She did not have notes. She'd decided against notes. I came to Coldwater Ridge 3 years ago with my mother, she said. My mother died. I stayed because I had no money to leave and no family to go back to. I worked for Agnes Pruitt on Sutter Street for 8 months, 12 hours a day, for wages that by January were not covering my room. I want you all to sit with that for a moment. I worked 12 hours a day, and I was ending each month in debt to the woman I worked for. She let that settle. No one from this council came to investigate my welfare then. No county official rode out to Agnes Pruitt's boarding house to verify the propriety of my arrangement there. The room was very quiet. Jim Haskell told me there was work at the Mercer Ranch, she continued. He told me as a joke. He expected me to walk 8 miles and be sent home humiliated, and he was looking forward to it. Instead, I walked 8 miles. I asked for the work plainly, and I was given it, fairly, with a written agreement, at better wages than I'd seen in 3 years. She looked at Briggs directly. I have been at the Double M for 4 months. In those 4 months, I have repaired a household that was falling apart, helped maintain livestock through one of the worst winters this county has had in a decade, and done honest work for honest pay. I have not been harmed. I have not been exploited. I have not, at any point, required the county's protection. Both sense. She paused. What I have required, and what this town has done its level best not to provide, is to be left alone to build something. Her voice stayed even. She'd promised herself even. I understand that my arrangement at the Double M makes some of you uncomfortable. I understand that a woman living and working on a man's property without the specific social arrangements you consider proper looks wrong to you. But I would ask you to consider what you are actually protecting when you move to remove me from that ranch. You're not protecting me. I'm telling you plainly that I do not want or need this protection. You are protecting an idea about how women should live and where they should be and what choices they are capable of making for themselves. She looked at the room, not at Briggs, not at Ruth Haskell, but at the middle of it, at the ordinary faces of ordinary people who had come to watch and had perhaps not entirely decided what they thought. I am capable of making my own choices. I made one this morning. She reached into the pocket of her coat, his coat. Still, she hadn't had time to retrieve her own, and placed the folded paper on the table in front of the council chair. That is a marriage license application, she said, signed by both of us this morning before we came into town. Ronan Mercer and I intend to marry. Not because this council has forced us to, not because we are afraid of what you will decide, because we have decided it ourselves, in our own time, for our own reasons, which are ours and not yours. She looked at Briggs one more time. I trust that resolves your concerns about my welfare, Councilman. Since I'm given to understand that a woman's welfare is only legible to this county when it comes with a certificate. She sat down. The silence lasted longer than silences usually do in rooms full of people. Theodore Marsh, the rancher from the north end of the county, looked at the paper on the table. Then he looked at Briggs. Then he said, quietly, but clearly enough to carry, I think we're done here, Franklin. Briggs's pleasantness didn't slip. It was too practiced for that. But something behind it did. Some assumption. Some certainty about how this room was going to go. Elena watched it happen and felt the cold clarity of having said exactly what she meant and having it land. Ronan's hand found hers under the table. Not dramatically, just his hand over hers briefly. A pressure and then a release. She didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead. The council deliberated for 22 minutes. They returned and the chair read a finding of no actionable concern regarding the Mercer property or its employees. Jim Haskell left before the finding was read. She noticed that too. Outside in the pale March light, with the hearing room emptying behind them and Foss shaking both their hands, and Coldwater Ridge's main street spread out around them in its ordinary and different way, Ronan stood next to her and looked at the road. That was, he started. Don't, she said. I was going to say it was well done. I know, don't. She wasn't ready for praise yet. She was still coming down from the place she'd gone to say what she'd said, which was a place she'd had to build in real time and wasn't sure she could find again. Just give me a minute. He gave her a minute. The wagon was where they'd left it. The horse was patient in the way horses are. The town went on around them, and some people looked, and some people didn't, and Elena stood on the sidewalk of Coldwater Ridge with her hands in the pockets of Ronan Mercer's coat and breathed the cold air in and then out, and felt the strange, precarious, real weight of what she'd just chosen. Not what had been chosen for her, not what she'd been pushed into, what she had looked at clearly in the 4 o'clock dark and decided was true. That was new. That was entirely new. And it was hers. They married on a Thursday, not because Thursday was significant, but because Gerald Foss was leaving for Dalton on Friday, and he was the only person either of them wanted as a witness, which said something about the state of their social lives that Elena chose not to examine too closely. The justice of the peace was a quiet man named Howard Brill, who smelled of pipe tobacco and performed the ceremony in his front parlor with the efficient warmth of someone who had done this many times and still believed in it, which Elena respected. She wore her serviceable dress. Ronan wore his good shirt, which she'd ironed that morning. She would later think about that. The fact that she'd ironed his shirt on the morning of the day she married him, as if it were any other task in a day's work, and she'd find something true in that rather than something diminishing. They stood in Howard Brill's parlor and said what needed to be said, and Foss signed the paper with his re-sewn leather case tucked under his arm. And that was the whole of it. Ronan shook Foss's hand at the wagon afterward. "You did well in there," Foss told him. "Elena did the work. You stood next to her." That's not nothing," Foss said firmly. "Don't discount it." He shook Elena's hand too, both of his wrapped around hers for a moment. "You're going to have trouble yet. The hearing was a battle, not the war. Briggs doesn't lose gracefully." "I know," Elena said. "Good." He released her hand and climbed up to his wagon. "Write me if you need me. I'll come back." He drove off down the Dalton Road and they watched him go, and then they climbed into their own wagon and drove the 8 miles back to the Double M in the early afternoon quiet. And when the gate came into view, Ronan pulled the horse up for a moment and looked at the property. The house, the barn, the fence line they'd repaired together in frozen ground, with an expression Elena hadn't seen on him before. Not quite peace, more like the cautious recognition of something that might last. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He flicked the reins and they went through the gate. Foss had been right that the trouble wasn't finished. Briggs did not lose gracefully. He lost quietly, which was worse, because quiet loss in a man like that doesn't mean acceptance. It means patience. It means waiting for a different angle. Through April, the Double M found itself on the receiving end of small, deniable pressures. A grazing rights question that someone raised with the county land office, and that required 3 letters and 6 weeks to resolve. A rumor that made its way through the cattle buyers network suggesting the Mercer stock was of uncertain quality, which cost them at the spring market. A visit from a county tax assessor who arrived with the particular energy of a man who'd been told to find something. He didn't find anything. Elena had been keeping the accounts in a second ledger since February, parallel to Ronan's, cross-checking figures with the attention of someone who understood that clean books were a form of armor. "You've been keeping double records?" Ronan said when she showed him the second ledger. "Since the first time the sheriff came," she said. "I thought it was prudent." He looked at the ledger, then at her. "You didn't tell me. I didn't want to alarm you before there was something to show." "That's either very smart or slightly insane." "I've been told both, in different contexts." He almost smiled. He was getting better at that, at letting expressions finish themselves instead of pulling them back. It was slow progress, the kind you measured in increments, but it was real. The tax assessor left without incident, which meant without the incident Briggs had been hoping for, and that was the last official move that came from that direction. Whether Briggs finally ran out of mechanisms or simply decided the return wasn't worth the effort, Elena couldn't say. But by June, the pressure had eased enough that she could feel the difference in the air, the way you feel a fever breaking. Not with relief exactly, but with the recognition that the thing that's been consuming your energy has stopped consuming it, and now you have to figure out what to do with the surplus. What she did with it was work. That summer was the hardest physical season she'd spent at the Double M, and also the most productive. With the spring cattle sales behind them and the finances stabilized, not recovered, not yet, but no longer bleeding, they were able to direct energy toward the ranch itself rather than the ranch's survival. The east barn roof, which had been a source of ongoing negotiation since January, was finally properly addressed. They hired a man from town named Garrett, who was a carpenter by training and a pragmatist by nature, and who showed up for 3 days and did the work and went home and didn't have opinions about Elena's presence on the property, which she appreciated more than she told him. She was up on the roof with Garrett and Ronan on the second day, passing boards, handing nails, holding what needed holding. Her boots were not good roof boots, and she knew it, and she'd tied a piece of rope around her waist looped to the chimney because she was not going to fall off her own barn roof out of pride. Garrett had looked at the rope arrangement and then looked at her and said nothing, which was exactly the right response. Ronan, passing her from below, had said, "That rope isn't rated for your weight." "I know, it's a psychological comfort. That's not how physics works." "I'm aware." He'd handed her the next board and gone back down the ladder. The roof took 3 days and held through the following winter, and the winter after that without issue, which was its own kind of satisfaction. The deep, unglamorous satisfaction of a thing done correctly that then simply works, year after year, without requiring further attention. The harder things took longer. Ronan's temper did not disappear because he'd chosen to change. It surfaced in October when a cattle deal went sideways, and he spent an entire afternoon in a fury that expressed itself mostly in silence and single-word answers, and one incident involving a fence post that she had not witnessed directly but heard clearly from the kitchen. She let him have the fury. She'd learned the shape of it, learned that his anger was almost never aimed at her, even when she was the nearest available person, that it was a creature that lived in him and needed to exhaust itself before he could be reasoned with. She made dinner. She left it on the stove. She went to bed. In the morning, he came into the kitchen while she was making coffee and stood by the door for a moment. "I was not good company yesterday," he said. "No." "I'm sorry." She turned and looked at him. He met her eyes without deflecting, which was new or newer. It had taken months of small moments to get there. "I know you are," she said. "You can make it up to me by fixing the hinge on the chicken coop. I've asked twice." A beat of silence. "The chicken coop? The hinge is loose. Every morning it takes me an extra 2 minutes because the door doesn't open right. I've asked twice." She handed him coffee. "That's what sorry looks like as an action." He fixed the hinge that morning. She noticed and didn't say anything about noticing. Some transactions don't need to be named to be understood. She had her own failures. She was not easy to argue with. She knew this about herself with the clear-eyed accuracy of someone who has had to fight for most things she'd wanted and had developed stubbornness as a survival tool and couldn't always tell, in the moment, when the fight was necessary and when it was just habit. There were times she dug in on things that didn't warrant digging in on, and Ronan would get a particular expression on his face, patient and slightly tired, and she'd eventually recognize it and recalibrate. Usually. Their arguments were rarely about the large things they'd somehow negotiated by necessity, having been forced to make real decisions under real pressure before they'd had the luxury of making easy ones. It was the small things that tripped them up. The division of the accounts ledger, how much to take on credit versus waiting, whether the north pasture fence was a this season repair or a next season repair. Small things that were really about something slightly larger. Who deferred to whom and when and on what basis. She'd said equal partnership on the morning she'd accepted his proposal. She'd meant it. But equal partnership is not a thing you establish once. It's a thing you reestablish over and over in 10-minute arguments about fence posts and grazing schedules until the process of it becomes more natural than the conflict that occasions it. They were, she thought, about 2 years into a 10-year project, which was not discouraging. It was just honest. The town changed in the way towns change when they find out they've misjudged something, slowly, partially, and without full admission. Jim Haskell never apologized. She hadn't expected him to. He reduced himself in her presence when their paths crossed, became somehow smaller and louder at the same time, the way men do when they know they've been wrong but have decided that pretending otherwise is preferable. She let him have that. She'd stopped carrying Coldwater Ridge's opinion of her as though it were her weight to manage. At some point, somewhere in the second half of that first year, she'd set it down. She wasn't sure exactly when. Ruth Haskell nodded to her on the street by Christmas of the first year. That was the extent of it, but it was a nod rather than the turned head of before, and in Coldwater Ridge's social ledger that counted as a revision. Mabel Greer was more direct, which Elena had always expected from her. She was not a bad woman, Mabel, just a woman shaped by a very particular world. She stopped Elena outside the hardware store in February, almost exactly a year after her visit to the Double M with the apple pie, and said, without preamble, "I think I misjudged you." "Most people did," Elena said. "I thought you were—" Mabel pressed her lips together. "I thought you were in a desperate situation and making poor choices." "I was in a desperate situation," Elena said. "The choices turned out not to be poor." "No," Mabel paused. "How is it out there?" "Truly." Elena thought about it. The chicken coop hinge, now fixed. The double ledger that had protected them from the tax assessor. The east barn roof that didn't leak. Ronan's face in the evenings, less defended than it had been, still not easy but increasingly legible. The way she knew the Double M's rhythms now as well as she'd ever known anything. Better, maybe, because she'd earned the knowing rather than inherited it. "It's hard," she said honestly. "It's a hard life. The ranch is still recovering. We have good months and bad ones. He's not always easy, and I'm not either." She looked at Mabel. "But it's ours. That part doesn't change with the seasons." Mabel nodded slowly. The conversation had a quality to it that Elena recognized. The quality of a small town taking the first careful step toward revising a story it had told about someone. It was imperfect, this step, and it didn't undo anything. But it was a step. The first woman arrived at the Double M in March of the second year. Her name was Sarah Denning, and she came the same way Elena had come, on foot, at the end of her rope, with a situation behind her that had closed off most of the options in front of her. She was younger than Elena by 4 years, with red hair and a raw look about her, the kind of rawness that comes from recent damage rather than constitution. She'd heard, through some chain of information Elena couldn't entirely trace, that there might be work out at the Mercer Ranch. Elena was on the porch when she came up the road. She watched her come and thought briefly about a cold morning in November, and 8 miles of frozen road, and the particular quality of having nowhere to fall back on. She thought about how she'd stood at the gate and looked at the broken-down ranch and registered that it wasn't ruined, just suspended halfway through going wrong, and that the two things were different. She went inside and told Ronan. "She's looking for work," she said. He was at the table with the ledger. He looked up. "What kind of work?" "Whatever we have." She met his eyes. "We could use someone in the house. I've been spending more time outside and the inside is suffering. We can't pay much." "I know. I'll tell her that." He looked at her for a moment. "Tell her she can have the south room," he said. "It's warmer than the second bedroom." Elena went back out to the porch. "Come in," she said to Sarah Denning. "There's coffee." Sarah stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her with the particular wariness of someone who has been disappointed before and is trying to prepare for it again. "I don't want charity," she said. "I want work." "I know," Elena said. "I didn't offer you charity. I offered you coffee." She held the door open. "Come in." Sarah came in. She stayed. She turned out to be stubborn in the particular way that women who've survived difficult things often are. Stubborn in a way that was useful rather than ornamental. And within 6 weeks she'd made the south room hers, and the interior of the house was better managed than it had been since Elena had stopped dividing her time evenly between inside and out. A second woman came the following autumn, a widow named Clara, which caused a moment of strange tension that Ronan handled by simply using her last name, calling her Mrs. Dre, with the practical efficiency of a man who had decided to deal with the thing that was actually in front of him rather than the coincidence it arrived wrapped in. Mrs. Dre was in her 40s, competent with animals, and had strong opinions about the organization of the tack room that turned out to be largely correct. Elena hadn't planned it. She was certain of that. She hadn't sat down one day and decided to turn the Double M into something larger than a cattle ranch. It had grown the way things grow when conditions allow, slowly, from the ground, in the direction of whatever the light was in. The ranch needed hands. Women needed places where they could work and keep their dignity. Those two facts had found each other without Elena having to arrange the introduction. By the 3rd year, there were 4 women working the Double M in various capacities, and the ranch's reputation had shifted from the place where Ronan Mercer lived like a feral thing to the place where you could find real work if you needed it. The town noticed. The town's relationship to that fact was complicated. Some people admired it. Some people found it unsettling for reasons they couldn't entirely articulate. Most people landed somewhere in the exhausted middle that most people occupy on most things. Briggs retired from the county council the year after the hearing. His replacement was Theodore Marsh, the North End rancher who had said, "I think we're done here," Franklin with a quietness that had carried. Marsh turned out to be a pragmatist of the functional kind, interested in the county's actual condition rather than its imagined one. And under him, the Double M's grazing rights question was resolved permanently, and the county's general interest in the Mercer property faded into the background of its other concerns, which were numerous and more pressing. Elena thought about Jim Haskell sometimes, not with bitterness, which surprised her, but with something more complicated. He'd sent her out here as a joke. He'd wanted to see her humiliated, brought low, reminded of where the town had decided her place was. And instead, he'd handed her something inadvertently, the way that people who think they're delivering blows sometimes deliver openings. She didn't thank him for it. She didn't forgive him either, particularly, because forgiveness implies he'd asked for it, which he hadn't. She just thought about the strange and impersonal mechanics of how things actually happen, how the thing that's designed to diminish, you can become the thing that doesn't if you walk toward it instead of away. She thought the better lesson, the one she carried with her in the practical, non-sentimental part of herself, was simpler. Desperation is not the same as powerlessness. She'd been desperate, genuinely, on that November morning when she'd walked 8 miles on empty. But desperation had not taken her choices away from her. She'd still had choices. They'd just been the kind of choices that required something from her: effort, nerve, the willingness to walk toward a thing that might go wrong, rather than the kind that arrived ready-made. She thought about that when she looked at Sarah and Mrs. Dray and the women who came after them. She didn't say it in those words because she was not a woman who delivered homilies, but she tried to make it present in the way she ran things, in the fact that no one at the Double M was asked to be grateful, only capable, in the fact that the work was real and the wages were fair and the expectations were stated plainly and without condescension. It was not a perfect operation. Nothing that involves human beings is. There were weeks when the accounts were tighter than comfort allowed, seasons when the weather took more than the ranch could easily absorb, days when Ronan's temper got the better of him, and days when her stubbornness got the better of her, and both of them had to reckon with the fact that they were imperfect people who had chosen a hard life together and were going to keep choosing it. That part didn't smooth out. She'd stopped expecting it to. What she had instead was this: a kitchen that smelled like something real in the mornings, a barn roof that held, a ledger that balanced, more months than not, a husband who had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to say the things that needed saying rather than carrying them until they became something heavier. A ranch that had come to her as a wreck and was no longer quite a wreck. And the knowing, bone deep, earned the hard way, not available for the price of wishing, that the version of herself who had stood in Agnes Pruitt's kitchen eating cold cornbread over the sink because no one had left her a chair at the table was not the whole story. She had walked out of that kitchen. She had walked 8 miles in the cold. She had blacked the stove with her bare hands and repaired the fence in frozen ground and stood up in a room full of people who expected her to be small and said clearly and without apology that she was not. She was still doing that, not with speeches anymore, just with the ordinary work of a Tuesday, with the fence posts and the account ledger and the south room door that she kept unlocked, always, for whoever was coming up the road with worn-out boots and nowhere to fall back on. They wouldn't all stay. She knew that. Some would find better options and leave, which was the whole point, that they could leave of their own accord towards something rather than being pushed away from something. Some would stay and make themselves part of the Double M's particular life, its arguments and its difficult seasons and its stubbornness. Either way, she'd have done the thing she'd come out here to do, the thing she hadn't known she was coming to do. Make a place where the work mattered. Make a place where showing up was enough to begin. She was on the porch on an evening in late October, years into it all, watching the light go flat and golden over the pasture, when Ronan came out and stood next to her. They did this sometimes. Stood, said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of conversation. "Garrett's coming back next week," he said. "The north fence needs work." "I know. I put it in the ledger." "I know you put it in the ledger." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the pasture. His face had changed over the years. Not softened, exactly. That wasn't the right word for him, and never would be. But opened. The way a room opens when you take down boards that were nailed over windows. You could see more of what was in there. "We had a good season," he said. "Better than last." "Better than last, yes." A pause. "There might be room to consider expanding the south pasture, if next season holds." "I've been thinking the same thing." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and between them was the weight of everything they'd done and the things they'd gotten wrong, and the length of time it had taken to get from a broken house, and a joke that wasn't funny to this ordinary, difficult, specific, ongoing thing. "It's a good piece of land," he said. "It is," she said. The pasture held the last of the light. The cattle were shapes moving in it, unhurried. Behind them, through the kitchen window, she could hear Sarah's voice and Mrs. Dre's answer and the ordinary sounds of a household that was genuinely, imperfectly alive. She looked out at the land that had been a punchline and had become something she'd helped build, and she thought, not for the first time, but with the quiet clarity that sometimes comes at the end of long days, that survival isn't only the dramatic moments. It isn't only the council hearing and the sheriff at the door and the 4 a.m. decisions. Most of survival is just the Tuesday, just the fence post, the ledger, the hinge on the chicken coop, just showing up to your own life and refusing, day after ordinary day, to stop. That was the whole of it. That was enough.